It just doesn't seem fair. Including spin-offs, the Switch has 4 Fire Emblem titles, 3 Xenoblade Chronicles and 6 Kirbys. And yet, while these titles sell respectably well, and are mostly reviewed very well, none of these have sold significantly more strongly than other titles which hardly get a look in. Metroid, which just had its second game, Pikmin, now only reaching its second, let alone any number of franchises that haven't made the Switch at all, from Tomodachi Life and F-Zero to Wave Race and Wario Land. Even in the ultra big leagues, things don't seem to be equal. Animal Crossing was an absolute juggernaut, but still has just a single Switch title, while no Pokemon game has sold equivalently to Animal Crossing, but 2 or 3 Pokemon games reliably hit the Switch each month. So, what's the deal? Why does Nintendo seem to play favourites with its franchises? Why does it seem that they're so inconsistent in how they respond to sales data with new entries? My theory is that it's not really playing favourites, but down to something far simpler that most people don't really factor into their considerations. Basically, it's all to do with ownership. Kirby is co-owned with HAL Laboratory. Fire Emblem is co-owned with Intelligent Systems. Pokemon's complicated ownership situation is well known, and even Xenoblade Chronicles is co-owned with Monolith Soft. But surely you say, Nintendo owns Monolith Soft. Well, yes, they own 96% of the company, but that 4% still entitles Monolith to a co-credit with Nintendo on games, and you can bet that credit confers financial rewards to people involved. Indeed, the original reason for buying Monolith was to offer a level of creative support to the staff there that wasn't really happening at Bandai and Square, and since Monolith had become an absolutely rock-solid development partner for Nintendo on games ranging from Pikmin 3 to Tears of the Kingdom, allowing them this extra creative freedom and commensurate financial rewards seems like a reasonable trade for a loyal and productive development partner. The upshot of this is that when commissioning new titles, Nintendo's partner studios have a vastly bigger incentive to want to push development resources into games where they have a stake. Intelligent Systems does produce other games such as Paper Mario, WarioWare, and Advance Wars, and they receive co-credits for the individual games, but to my knowledge they don't own these properties, although I can't quite find confirmation of Advance Wars' ownership status, so shoot me a message in the comments if you can add light to this subject. But why do the partner studios want to stick with the tried and true, while Nintendo seems so reticent to let some of their franchises see the light of day? My hunch is that it's differing priorities. Like a shark, Nintendo knows it has to move or die, and so a good amount of its resources always have to be investing in the next new thing. A company the size of HAL can dine off Kirby for decades to come, but Nintendo has to be so much more diversified, and it also has relatively finite production capacity. Training up the next generation of developers to the exacting standards Kyoto expects is not by any means a quick process. And the flip side of this is that the small companies have shallower pockets than Nintendo. Nintendo can afford to take its time, but if you're running HAL or Intelligent Systems, you need to keep putting titles out to keep the lights on. This is why some franchises seem to be treated so very differently. If a franchise like Splatoon or Animal Crossing were co-owned, you could easily imagine multiple spin-offs by now of each alongside a regular rhythm of main games. But for Nintendo, they need to make each of these titles really count because their development resources are much more spread around. This is to the detriment of some of their smaller franchises like Pikmin, Chibi Robo, F-Zero and others, which end up slightly frozen out of the picture. This also goes some way to explaining why we've seen 4 different Warriors crossovers with Nintendo properties, 2 for Hyrule Warriors, 2 for Fire Emblem Warriors. This is because Koei Tecmo own the Warriors property and the Warriors franchise. Although the games themselves and the characters themselves are obviously developed with Nintendo, the fact that they own the property means that the financial incentives for them are that much more significant. In fact, in the case of Koei Tecmo, it has an even bigger potential impact on them, because as people discover the Warriors titles, they may well go and sample Dynasty Warriors or other games that they have created using the Warriors format, meaning that there is even more likelihood that they could have long-tail profits from their partnerships with Nintendo. This being the case, I would fully expect there to be more and more Warriors titles, and I think the chances of a new Warriors crossover within the first 12 months of the next system are pretty high at this point. I also think the chances of an Imprisoning War Hyrule Warriors prequel, just in the same vein as Age of Calamity, is another thing that you can pretty much lock in. For budding Nintendo forecasters looking at Nintendo's future, this means we need to bear a few things in mind. Firstly, the chances of sequels in games with co-ownership arrangements are always going to be stronger. Astral Chain is one example that springs to mind. It hasn't had a sequel yet, but I would say the odds of Platinum working on that game will be much greater than a work-for-hire situation on, say, another Star Fox, just because it makes so much more financial sense for Platinum to work on a property they own. Similarly, in my recent video on Grezzo, the team usually tasked with ports and 2D Zelda, I may have slightly underestimated the likelihood of them returning in some form to their original property from the 3DS, Ever Oasis. And it will be interesting to see as Nintendo launches new properties which ones end up with some kind of co-ownership arrangements, because the threshold for these to become staple franchises with regular releases may be lower than Nintendo's wholly owned games. Secondly, we should be factoring into expectations of future release schedules that some of these co-owned titles are likely to appear at an accelerated rate. An average of at least 2 Pokemon games most years, well, I think most people could have predicted that, but a Kirby most years on average, a Fire Emblem or tie-in game every 18 months or 2 years, and even a Xenoblade game every 2 to 3 years, these seem like the kind of predictions that we can lock in for the foreseeable future. It's not that these companies may not face delays, or even that Nintendo won't sometimes commission them for different projects with their marquee IPs, but the gravity bringing them back to the same franchise again and again at a relatively fast turnaround time is their stake in the properties. Thirdly, this doesn't necessarily spell doom and obscurity for Nintendo's smaller, wholly owned games. For one thing, the guarantee of quality is somewhat higher with games that Nintendo do own themselves. I think if you compare the treatment of Pokemon and Zelda, it's particularly instructive. Pokemon games are frequent but often rushed, whereas Zelda games are infrequent, but when they arrive they are jewel in the crown titles. Also, Nintendo isn't completely averse to multiple iterations of the same franchise. They've launched multiple Splatoons, Mario Parties, and so on. It just means that the bar to have more than one type of game on the system is higher, because having a second in a franchise on the same system means stopping a potentially exciting new project from getting off the ground. They only have limited resources. And actually, that's a reasonable concern. It's good that Nintendo is so diversified and ambitious. It's good that they continue to keep trying new things. I, for one, would not want to lose things like Splatoon and ARMS and Astral Chain. Hopefully, though, the sustained success of the Nintendo Switch has allowed the Big N to diversify its development partners and expand so that there's more resilience and more capacity to develop more of these games. The partnerships with amazing developers like Mercury Steam, WayForward and Grezzo have certainly made me feel more optimistic on that front. However, this is something that I will definitely be factoring into future forecasts as we look to see what kind of games Nintendo are going to be producing over the next couple of years. Thank you so much for listening, and if you've got any thoughts yourself, please put them in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please put a like on it, and if you look on the screen right now, there are a couple of other videos which you might enjoy as well.